Hello, relatives, comrades, listeners, guests. This is the Red Nation Podcast. I am your host, Jennifer Marley. Today we are joined by Beata Tsosie-Peña and Tina Cordova, two amazing organizers who have done such groundbreaking work around nuclear abolition, and especially informing people about legacy waste and the impacts of nuclear colonialism in New Mexico. Thank you so much to all of our patrons who make this show a possibility, who help support all of the work that the Red Nation does, and by extension, all of the communities we work with. Without you and without your patronage, this would not be possible. So please subscribe and share. You know what to do. And thank you again. So let's jump right into this. I'm going to let you two introduce yourselves. Let's go ahead and start with Beata.
Biat Gimdi, Singitidi, all my relatives and family, it's good to be here. My name is Beata Tsosie from Santa Clara Pueblo. I apologize for being off camera. I'm not feeling that great today, but hopefully you can hear me okay, despite a little bit of a hoarse voice. And I have been doing environmental and reproductive health and justice work and advocacy for over a decade now. I do consider myself really rooted in my land-based culture, and I have a big cornfield this year that's beautiful. I have 3 beautiful kids that are doing great, and I'm a organizational director for Breath of My Heart Birthplace. It's an Indigenous-led birth center in traditional Hapo-Winge territory, and I'm also a birth worker, and I teach Indigenous sustainable design. So a lot of little hats, but they all intersect around the health of our environment and how that impacts the health of our peoples. And I'm really honored to be here with my mentor, Tina, I've been fortunate to learn a lot from over the years. I'll pass it on to you, Tina.
Thank you, Beata. My name is Tina Cordova, and I'm a native New Mexican, a downwinder, and a cancer survivor. I grew up in Tularosa, which is in south central New Mexico. It happens to be about 45 miles the way the crows fly from the Trinity test site. I'm an organizer and an advocate and have been leading the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, or TBDC, for 18 years. We started in 2005 to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico as a result of being overexposed to radiation from the Trinity test. But what we've learned in these 18 years is that it's so much more than just the Trinity test. It all began with the uranium workers, the people in northern New Mexico who live adjacent to the Los Alamos labs, and then those of us who live adjacent to the Trinity test site. All of us had our lives and our lands invaded when they established the Manhattan Project here and then conducted the Trinity test and other nuclear tests. And my ultimate goal is to see that the people of New Mexico receive justice for the harm that's been done to us as a result of the nuclear cycle that takes place here. And I'm very glad to be with you, Jennifer. And I have always said, or I have said many times to Beata, that if I had a daughter, I would hope that she'd be just like Beata.
I love that. Beata's an amazing daughter, ko'o, relative all around. I just love the both of you. I consider you both my aunties, for sure. I have learned so much from you, and I'm always continuing to. So this is a very special podcast. It's especially special to me because this is the day of Zia Feast. That's my motherland. And so thank you again for joining us. I wanted to ask you, Tina, to explain to our listeners what is the nuclear cycle and why is it significant in New Mexico? What does that mean for us here?
Well, a very long time ago, it was decided that New Mexico would be a sacrifice zone. We have the cradle to grave process taking place here. The cradle is the opening up of the earth and the extraction of uranium. Indigenous people always knew that the uranium should stay in the earth and it should never be touched or bothered. But in New Mexico, across Navajo Nation, Laguna, and Acoma Pueblo, we have 1,000 abandoned uranium mine and mill sites where they extracted 32 million tons. I always tell people, try wrapping your mind around that, 32 million tons of uranium. And they basically left those mine sites abandoned, and they're all Superfund sites, and the tailings are still out there all across uh, the Navajo Nation, Laguna, and Acoma Pueblo. I've visited there, and it's a sight to see. I'll tell you, it's heartbreaking actually. So there's the mining of uranium. That's the cradle, and then we have the development and testing of nuclear devices in New Mexico. During the early years of development of nuclear devices, they freely dumped the waste from Los Alamos labs into the canyons there. Obviously, that became part of our watershed, eventually makes its way to the Rio Grande. Should be of concern to everybody who lives in New Mexico. This stuff just doesn't go away. And then we had the testing of nuclear devices. Everybody's familiar with Trinity, but we had 3 other tests. We had a test in advance of Trinity called the 100-ton test that took place out at White Sands Missile Range. It was a precursor to Trinity. They wanted to see what was going to happen with the fallout, so they used conventional explosives, laced it with plutonium, and tracked fallout. And then we had 2 plowshares tests in New Mexico, and a lot of people are not aware of this. This was in the 70s. We had one in the Four Corners area near Farmington. That one was called Gas Buggy. And then we had one near Carlsbad called Gnome. And both of them vented a great deal of radiation, also never tracked or traced, just like Trinity. And then aside from that, we have the only permanent repository for nuclear waste any place in the United States at WIP. And New Mexico is under consideration now for a permanent repository for spent plutonium rods, high-level waste. We were always promised when they established WIP that they would never bring high-level waste here, but now we're under consideration for that, as much as the people of New Mexico, along with all of our elected officials, are against it. So that's the cradle to grave process, or the nuclear cycle that takes place in New Mexico. We've all been affected by it. I always tell people, you may not identify as a downwinder, but if you live in New Mexico, you're downwind of a nuclear site.
That's right. Yep. You're the one who taught me to say that we're all downwinders if we're here in New Mexico. And these past 2 years, I taught Intro to Southwest Studies. I reminded my students of that. And I reminded them that even if you're here short term, you are being exposed by default. Thank you so much, Tina.
Well, just very quickly, let me say this. There's a professor from Northern Arizona University that just released findings about 2 weeks ago. He's come here and taken soil samples north of the Trinity test site, and he found plutonium that has a Trinity footprint all the way in Truchas. So I know, so people don't realize. And he's going to now return in September and take samples south of the Trinity test site. But imagine there's plutonium from Trinity all the way to Truchas, New Mexico.
Wow, that is so disturbing. I'm definitely interested in looking at that when it becomes available. I'd love to point our listeners in that direction too. And that's disturbing for us. I mean, hearing that, I'm sure, Beata, you think about our northern sacred mountain, right? And just the span that this has on our homeland. And I wanted to ask you, so being that I am familiar with your work, I want to kind of like hear about how the work you do with reclaiming traditional birth, what does this have to do with our fight against nuclear colonialism too?
Well, one of the tenets of reproductive justice is the right to raise our children and families in a clean, healthy, safe environment, as a basic human right. And Indigenous peoples have always been under attack with the rights to have our children in any form. And, that's been through legacies of genocidal policies and schools. I don't even like calling them schools. Concentration camps for children, and thinking about even the era of when the military occupation of our Pajarito Plateau by the U.S. government was going on. It was these boarding schools. It was the Relocation Act that was displacing Native families. It was the ongoing sterilization of Native families, and so this is like policies that were coinciding with genocidal policies against our reproductive rights. And it's well known that, we're indicators for the health of our environment, and the lack of access that we have to our sacred places, to our natural resources, that help to make us healthy and strong, and then now living with legacy waste contamination and generational harm from these tests, like the Trinity test and others, that we're still even advocating for proof that that's happened. We're still needing to try and get all these like crazy studies that to validate the harm that we know is happening on a daily basis. We're dealing with some of the only toxins that can cross placental boundaries. They're looking at increasing weapons production and pit production at Los Alamos, which means increase of that waste stream, that part of the cycle that Tina was describing. It's just atrocious what we have to deal with and continue to endure with militarism in our homelands, when that original harm hasn't even been remedied, and our lands haven't been restored to their pristine state that they were before the Los Alamos occupation.
Thank you so much, Beata. So let's get into this movie. I know, Beata, you chose to boycott it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's too traumatic for me. I've tried. I go to things sometimes, but I'm definitely not going to pay money to go to them. So I was, in my internal dialogue, I'm like, I'll wait for it to come out on Netflix, if anything, But I know the story very well, firsthand through my lived experience. I don't need to see it sensationalized. I don't need to contribute my dollars to it. And it's very draining, the constant erasure of Indigenous people's voices and stories, and the glorification of war, which is completely opposite of our values as Indigenous peoples of this place. So I felt no loss in not seeing it yet. I was following, the reviews and some of the stuff going on, but it's kind of what I expected from what I've heard. But yeah, I'll wait to see it.
Yeah, I don't blame anyone for boycotting it. And Tina, I saw that you were on a panel for a screening of Oppenheimer in Santa Fe. I wanted to go to that so bad, but the space sold out before I could. But you were on a panel with some interesting people. Do you want to talk about the way you received the movie, and maybe a little bit about how that panel went?
Yeah, well, first I want to say this. When they came here, and I already said it, but I'm gonna re-emphasize it. When they came here to establish the Manhattan Project and conduct the Trinity test, they invaded our lands and our lives, and they left. They never acknowledged any part of the people that lived in New Mexico. They acknowledged nothing. They left. They left us here to deal with, that mess. And it has been forever affecting us. Then when they come here to film this movie, and I am a supporter of the movie industry in New Mexico. My brother works in that industry, and I'm a supporter of the industry. So let me say that first. But when they came here to film Oppenheimer, it was a nothing more than another invasion of our lands and our lives. We're a poor state. They use our tax incentives. They filmed this blockbuster movie. Their sales of tickets now worldwide have exceeded $500 million. They're going to make hundreds of millions of dollars off of this. And it's nothing but exploitation, because when we reached out to them to ask them just to include a panel at the end that acknowledged the sacrifice and suffering of the people of New Mexico, we were told that they weren't interested. And let me tell you something. I saw the movie. I went, I had reservations about seeing it, but I kept thinking, honestly, I've heard about that day from so many people, and I kept thinking, this is probably the closest I'll ever be to what that day was like, what that experience might have been like. I saw the movie. Um, it was an overglorification of the science and scientists. They reflected nobody from New Mexico. They didn't show somebody pumping gas, building a road, building a bridge, cooking a meal, changing a diaper. They didn't show us living 12 miles from the test site. And I always tell everybody, without the people who extracted uranium, there's no fissile material, there's no bomb, there's no Oppenheimer, there's no movie, there's no Manhattan, there's no Trinity. Uh, Without the people of New Mexico who built the roads, the bridges, the facilities, and then landed up being the janitors that cleaned those facilities, without the women that were bussed up there to cook every meal, clean every house, feed every baby bottle. There's nobody living in Los Alamos without the support we gave, and without the people in southern New Mexico as well who also built the Trinity site. And they don't it's as if the whole thing happened in a vacuum, right? Because they don't reflect a single person from New Mexico in the movie. And shame on them. Shame on them, because this is nothing more than exploitation. I always tell people, if you Google search anything right now about Trinity, you're going to find us. You're going to find out about the people of New Mexico who have been so horribly harmed. And I do not give them a pass card. They came here, they invaded our lands and our lives, they exploited our state, and they're going to run away with hundreds of millions of dollars and probably, an Academy Award or two. And shame on them. But it has opened a door for us that we have walked through, and we're getting so much attention right now because they left us out. And I can't even describe to you how we're being contacted constantly now by press and media and just the average person who wants to help us and join with us. So their grave omission of the people of New Mexico has resulted in a great deal of attention for us.
I'm really glad to hear that you all are getting these hits on your website and that people are more interested because of this, because at least at least there's kind of this silver lining. It's Did you want to respond to that too, Beata?
I have mixed emotions hearing you talk about that, Tina, because I know just how tirelessly and how much you have devoted your life to justice for your communities and everyone in New Mexico. And it's heartbreaking that it has to be negative attention that gets the attention. But I also know that there was a big win that happened around the release of the movie with the RICA amendment passing, which you had been working on for decades. And I would personally love to hear just how it was just this movement of energy and momentum with the topic, and then here was this RICA amendment that passed, and it was just like, wow, what is happening? And because I do believe that all this energy that activists have been putting into it is not for anything. I do choose to be careful in how I put my energy into this these days, for my own well-being. But we don't have the luxury of not doing that, like a lot of people. And I don't know, I'm curious too, like how that felt with having that huge legislative win with the release of the movie from your perspective, because you had been working so hard on that so long.
Well, Beata, that's a great question. I actually am not sure the movie influenced the vote in Congress. I think it might have a little bit, and it will maybe influence the vote in the House, or as they reconcile the National Defense Authorization Act. It may influence that because that's going to take place over the next few months. But that vote, they released that movie like July 20, I don't remember, July 21st or something like that. And that vote took place July 27th. There is no way that movie influenced that vote that quickly. I don't think members of Congress had seen it, but I can tell you what did happen. For the first time ever, we had somebody who is a Republican leader in the Senate, Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri. He's Republican. He was interested in adding the people who were affected in the St. Louis area because they enriched uranium there during the Manhattan Project, and they dumped the waste there. And now that waste has made its way into the water supply, and they even have a school that they've shut down because they've detected the waste at the school. I wish they'd come and test the schools around here. But anyway, it was simply one of those alignments, Beata, of the stars, honestly, because I saw a speech that Josh Hawley delivered on the Senate floor, Senator Hawley, and he was very impassioned. And I sent the video to Senator Lujan's staff, and I said, have you all seen this? You should reach out to him. And they thanked me for sending it, and they said, we will. And honestly, this all cascaded from there. They called me about 5 days later and said, there's going to be a vote tomorrow on the NDAA, and Senator Hawley has agreed to work with us on the RICA amendments if we add St. Louis. And it's a long shot, but we're going to try. And I knew it was the longest of long shots, and I wasn't going to get my hopes up. And when it happened, Beata, I experienced so much emotion that day. I was in my office and I was yelling with emotion, and my son came in and he said, what's happened? And I said, it passed. And he wrapped his arms around me and my legs gave out from under me. Yeah, I feel like I'm gonna be emotional right now, but it was so much emotion because for the longest time we have been fighting this fight. And I have said many times, we're going to keep doing this until we see success or until they bury us. And, it just seems like sometimes you just have to outlast them. And I just feel like there's this perfect alignment right now of the stars for this. And when I say stars, I certainly don't mean people in Hollywood. What I mean is, our God is good. And everybody believes in a higher power, and the higher power is at work in this right now. And it's in his hands. And I always knew that it had to be on God's time, not my time, and the time would come. And I just feel very positive right now. Who knows what will happen, but we've never come this far. I can tell you that. And it has nothing to do with the movie. The vote in the Senate, I don't think Beata had anything to do with the movie, but the vote in the House sure might.
No, I was referring more to just like the simultaneous energy of the two kind of coalescing,
Right, right.
Yeah, the vote was all you.
Well, no, that's kind of interesting that you say that. It isn't. It's you just don't know what's going to happen in DC. You don't know what's going to drive people to do the right thing. I keep saying they can either get on board, and this is a winning process, a bipartisan process, because it's a nonpartisan issue, and they can either get on board or they can go down in history as those people who blocked justice for those of us in the American West who had our lives destroyed by the development and testing of nuclear devices.
Mm-hmm. I hope it opens a lot of doors for the generational impacts now, even in the Pueblos, for what's happened.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to ask as a follow-up question is what do you hope to see now as a result of the RICA amendments? What do you hope to see now in your lifetimes?
I know I lost so many elders and grandparents to cancers that everyone says never existed before the labs were here. We have the need for so much data and comprehensive community-led studies on what it is exactly we're dealing with in our soils, in our crops, in our birthing, in our reproductive health, in what the immunocompromisation of of people being born today. And I think there's families that deserve retroactive compensation, from that never got compensated or were discriminated against or didn't have support in the system to like go through the process. They're still trying to get information of like who's eligible for compensation. And I really think like there needs to be universal, top-notch, top-of-the-line healthcare for everybody in this state, regardless of because of our proximity to all of these things, and we need to have birth centers in every community and access to like every kind of like wellness and healthcare imaginable. True cleanup of contaminated and legacy waste sites, including the uranium mines, because we know that the illnesses are going to continue with a lot of these other factors leading up to this. I want to see the labs shut down as a nuclear production facility and devoted solely to cleanup. I want to see our sacred sites restored and given to us. I want to see Area G off of our watershed, the nuclear waste dump. I want standards that are protective of Indigenous pregnant people in our state, that reflect environmental regulations that protect those most vulnerable. I could go on and on, but it is this spiral effect of justice and what that looks like in restorative justice and land back to the Native peoples. They don't know what to do with these contaminated sites. I guarantee you we could do a better job of remediating these places and managing them, in a sense, holding them as sacred so that it doesn't happen again for future generations. We know how to put things to rest in a way that has meaning and honors the impacts of what happened. And so there's so much that needs to be done, and I really hope that this is a spiral of that energy and that higher power healing that Tina referenced, because it is so long overdue for everyone.
Absolutely, Beata. That is so wise. Everything that you just said is so wise, so necessary. And the RICA amendments are only going to address, this partially. There's still so much for us to do, but we can't stop fighting these fights. They definitely depended on us to be uneducated, unsophisticated, and unable to stand up for ourselves when this all started here. And there's a level of environmental racism associated with this that we all have to recognize. We cannot change what has happened in the past, but we can address what happens in the future. And we have to stand firm. There is no way that anybody in the state of New Mexico should accept the idea that high-level waste should be a part of our environment. And let me just explain, oh my gosh, I always think, how do people think it's okay? WIP only stores low-level waste. And in 2015, because the company that manages the lab, it's a for-profit company, decided to use a cheaper cat litter, mind you. They actually switched to a cheaper cat litter. There was a chemical reaction that took place, and it popped barrels inside WIP. It closed WIP down for 5 years, and it cost about $3 billion to abate that. Okay, Holtec is a private company. They'll never be able to buy, billions of dollars in insurance. If they have a high-level catastrophe at Holtec here in New Mexico, they're going to walk away. They're a private enterprise. They'll file bankruptcy. They'll walk out of our state, and the people in New Mexico will be left holding the bag. And you know what? We can't trust that this is ever going to be 100% safe, because we've heard that before. They've, like Beata just said, they've never come back to address the mess they made from the get-go. And what makes any of us think, and that's the government, what makes any of us think that a private enterprise, a private for-profit enterprise, is ever going to come back to take care of us? And plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. 24,000 years. They're finding plutonium as far north as Truchas that has a half-life of 24,000 years. it'll never be gone.
And
Where it's
we did
too much of a hazardous location for any of these activities in New Mexico. Like, the accidents have been nonstop. It's not like there's been tons of accidents and exposures and things. Like, they've gotten the lowest freaking ratings for safety in a lot of these facilities. You know, they don't have a good track record of safety and preventative anything. So the disasters are going to continue.
Right. And it's not a priority. And even in the movie, it's very blatant that it never was. It never was, like, from the start, and it still is not. I was actually surprised that the movie was as open as they were about the fact that they did not care under what circumstances the bomb had to be made. They were willing to take the risks of knowing it could ignite the atmosphere. They made bets on it jokingly in the movie, right? So they're being open about this, about the lack of care, right, for people in this state. And as I was watching, I couldn't help but think about Mariah Gomez's new book, Nuclear Nuevo Mexico. Yes, I want her so bad. We might even do a part 2. Let's see. But she said something when I went to her book talk for this that was so profound. She says New Mexico is called a sacrifice zone, but she says, I say it's not, because in order for it to be a sacrifice zone, the government would have had to feel like they were making a sacrifice in the first place, and they never felt that way. And so in that sense, New Mexico wasn't a sacrifice. It's just simply, in the eyes of the federal government, a resource colony, right? But of course we know we're so much more than that, right? And we know the strength of the people that live here. And going back, Tina, you pointed out there's absolutely zero representation of anybody from New Mexico in this film. I've had relatives who have portrayed natives in multiple other shows or, lower budget movies about the Manhattan Project, right? And I'm somebody who doesn't believe that representation is always a good thing either, right? We had that Dr. Atomic opera some years back where Native people were represented in all these ways, but only for the sake of glorifying the bomb. And so I was still even shocked about that, because that is revising history in and of itself, right? That is taking the people who were here and are here completely out of the public eye. And in the movie, you see only brief mentions, right? Oppenheimer says, give the land back to the Indians, right? And we're supposed to clap and cheer for him being so progressive, right? It paints him as such a malevolent figure. And and the fact that the Tularosa Basin Downwinders specifically, there is no mention of them. Places like Los Alamos and White Sands are made to be super desolate, ultra isolated places, which is just, of course, a modern day assertion of terra nullius, right? It's okay, there was no one there, right? And so the movie is like okay with putting some of these facts out there while still maintaining that Oppenheimer himself was a malevolent, heroic figure who felt so bad about what he did and contributed to. And I say, as you said, Tina, nobody deserves that kind of sympathy, right? Nobody deserves that kind of redemption, and that's exactly what this movie is aiming to do. They even try to, paint him as a progressive person, as a socialist, as somebody who was so radical that he had to be taken off of, that he lost his clearance, right? But the only reason he lost his clearance is he became an anti-nuclear advocate, and he was intending to speak out against the creation of the H-bomb, right? It's only when he stopped working in those interests does he become a threat, not because he inherently held these beliefs that were so progressive. And I'm also very interested in the story behind how Oppenheimer and his brother got land here, right? They had a ranch and that, and I just want to make this really clear for our viewers. Oppenheimer himself chose Los Alamos as the first site of the Manhattan Project. There is nothing malevolent about that. If you're somebody that we need to blame, it is him, right? Who openly pointed to this land and said, this is the spot, we have to do it. And so no plea to give it back to the Indians after means anything. Give us back land that is profoundly irradiated, right? Yeah, the movie is...
Jen, do you want me to tell you about the history, about how he fell in love with New Mexico? He was a sick young man. He was sickly.
Tuberculosis?
Well, I don't think it was TB, but his parents were exceedingly wealthy. And they would send him to a ranch in the Pecos that was owned by a Mexican family. They were Mexicanos, and they owned a ranch there, and he traveled there, and eventually his brother did too, and they fell in love with New Mexico. And in the film, he makes it very clear. There's that saying that was attributed to him about how the two loves in his life were New Mexico and physics. And by establishing Los Alamos, he joined the two, he married the two. And, you know, one of the things I want to say is that I don't have any sympathy for Robert Oppenheimer, because I've lately been saying he and my dad had a very similar cancer that took their lives, right? The difference between Robert Oppenheimer and my dad is that my dad wasn't a chain smoker and he never had a martini. Never. My dad never, I guarantee my dad never tasted vodka. He might have a beer every now and then, but my dad wasn't a drinker, wasn't a smoker, didn't use chewing tobacco, and he got oral cancer twice. He had no viruses. I asked the doctors, how does this happen? Twice. These were two distinctly different cancers, and they said it is so rare, but we see it all the time in New Mexico. And so while Robert Oppenheimer was incredibly flawed and was a chain smoker and a heavy drinker, he got throat cancer, you know, but my dad was none of those things, and he got oral cancer. And that is the history and the legacy of Robert Oppenheimer falling in love with our state. He came here, he established this horrific institute that we've lived with ever since, right? Like Beata said, the labs are still an invasion of our lands and our lives. And he established that and left, basically. And we have dealt with the consequences ever since. And I don't give Robert Oppenheimer a pass card. And I always tell people, you know what? I would put my dad up against him in every way. My dad would have outridden him horseback, outfished him, outhunted him, outran him in a foot race. The only thing my dad wouldn't have been able to do is theoretical physics. But if he didn't had an education, he might have been able to. And they won't write a screenplay about my dad's life. And my dad wasn't a flawed man like Robert Oppenheimer. And so our dads who lived every day and worked hard every day to try to put food on the table, that lived for their families and to take care of their families and to make sure we had what we needed, and that we went to church, and that we, you know, all of the things that were out of goodness, those were what our dads were. And their lives will never be over glorified in some big Hollywood movie. And it, to me, like I said, it's exploitation. And I'm sorry, I don't feel sorry for Robert Oppenheimer. He knew, you know, the other thing is he had the benefit of his education. He signed up for the job he had. The rest of us were enlisted without consent or knowledge. We didn't sign up for this.
It's interesting too. I've seen some responses of like, well, they didn't know it was harmful, or they didn't know what the aftermath was going to be. And so like they get some kind of pass, these scientists. You know, they knew. They had been testing on animals. They had been testing on all kinds of things in like really twisted ways leading up to the Trinity test. And why the heck did they start fleeing? And I heard this story from you, Tina, with bread over their mouths when they saw the fallout coming down. They were barbecuing and celebrating, and when they saw that ash coming down, they covered their mouths with bread and left, and didn't tell the tens of thousands of people anything. about why they left that way and
There
left
were
them to like that exposure.
there were half a million people living in a 150-mile radius. 500,000 people, children, women, and men. And to Beata's point, in the months after Trinity, we had a spike in infant mortality all across our state. We had casualties from Trinity. They were our babies. Their little bodies couldn't stand the radiation load. And then their moms were concentrating the radiation in their mammary glands and breastfeeding them. And they were dying. And the government's never atoned for any single part of this. And it's beyond egregious. It's unforgivable. I've said it over and over. I'll never forgive our government for what they did to us. And I think people need to understand something else. We have never been, the state of New Mexico has never been one of those states that asks for more from our government than we deserve. In World War II, we had more people enlisted per capita of any state in the Union. More people died. We bought more war bonds. We even donated farm equipment, and we were the first people to die in the Philippines after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so my grandfather's buried in Belgium, my dad's dad. My family's given everything to this, and so have so many families. So we've never asked more from our government than what we've given. And it's such a huge injustice. We have been relegated to nothingness, and you have to start asking the question. It begs the question: is it because of the color of our skin? We're the only minority majority state that has been so from the beginning of statehood.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly the argument made in this book, right? That's exactly the argument that organizers and activists have been making for decades. Another example, right, much in line with like the stories you shared about your dad, Tina. My great grandmother from San Ildefonso, she was a nanny. She was a domestic worker for these scientists up at the labs. That's how she spent most of her time. It prevented her from having a stronger relationship with her own children, which, affects us generationally. And now my cousin works as a caretaker for who was one of the head theoretical physicists at LANL for many years. He met Oppenheimer as a boy, and now in his old age, she is taking care of him. And so we see that nothing changes, right? We never get back what they claim we're going to get back. That wealth doesn't come back to us. The resources doesn't come back to us. The health doesn't come back to us, right? It's a cycle of continuous exploitation, and it's going to continue as long as these institutions exist here, right? And I'm sure people have countless examples, right? Mariah begins her book with the story about her uncle who passed away from cancer, who was a longtime worker at the labs. There's countless oral histories about workers bringing home tools or, bringing home their clothes and their wives get cancer. I found it interesting too, in the movie at one point, they have a scene, it's real brief, where one of the physicists is telling a woman, oh, you can't work on this project because we don't know what it can do to the female reproductive system. And so, of course, in the movie, they're showing that to say like, oh, there was sexism that happened. Women weren't allowed to do certain things. But it was so ironic to me that was being like that talking point was being taken up in that context, but never talking about the many, many women, indigenous women, Hispano women, Nuevo Mexicano women who were going up there and doing that domestic labor, right? It's like they're not worthy of that protection, which we know is still a prevailing logic when we're talking about these things, right? Did you want to add on to that, Beata?
Yeah, I've heard similar stories from elders that used to go and work up there and how they would even things that were contaminated, that they wouldn't understand why they were throwing them out, and they would bring them home. They would bring home clothing. They would bring home like tools. Some of the workers, they knew some of the impacts, and so they were handing out cartons of cigarettes for free to all the workers to mask the lung cancers from the airborne plutonium being released into our skies at that time. I had a aunt that worked at the Santa Clara Clinic, and she was flabbergasted at the amount of lung cancers for one generation. She's like, this is not a normal amount of lung cancer, and yet and then it's just this denial of the violence, and making impacted communities have to prove it, and that's just so gross to me. It's just yeah. And then as far as they've never centered reproductive rights and standards of protection. The standard to this day is based off an adult white male for radiation exposure in this country. If they're gonna put that line in the movie that, oh, what about our reproductive health? But the current standard for radiation exposure is an adult white male, like that's a lie.
Yeah, it honestly blew my mind that was in there. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Did you want to? Yeah, I couldn't believe that was in there, because I was like, this is, at this time, I don't even think Reference Man had been created, right? Like, and they weren't telling the public about any of these impacts, but they knew enough for that to be said in that film, right? They knew, or at least speculated to that extent, that they were willing to use it as a way to exclude women from working on the Manhattan Project, right?
I think it's that revisionist take slant you're talking about.
Yeah, they well knew in the 1940s that radiation was dangerous to human health. It was a well-established fact, and they just didn't care, honestly. If you read about the history of the Manhattan Project, especially General Groves, he had no concern for human health. They assigned physicians, to look out for human health, and every time they cried foul on General Groves, he absolutely said no to them. I mean, I want to share a story with you guys. It'll give you an idea of how little concern they had for human health, or the people of New Mexico. So the meteorologists and the physicians that were assigned to the test at Trinity started raising concerns with General Groves after the 110 test in May. And they started saying, we can't do this during the rainy season. It's going to spread radiation all over the Tularosa Basin. And General Groves said, tough, it's happening. So they told him, we need to prepare to evacuate people. At the very least, we at least need to prepare to evacuate. So there was rail systems already, well-established rail systems in Carrizozo, San Antonio, Socorro, Tularosa, all the communities closest. And General Groves was finally convinced that he should prepare to evacuate the people in Carrizozo. And instead of lining up rail cars where they could actually seat people and take them out on the rail system, they lined up cattle trucks. And I always tell people, we don't even move cows in July in that area because it's too hot and it's inhumane. But a cattle truck is filthy. There's no place to sit down. There's very little ventilation. The roads were dirt roads. So the best he could come up with for us was to line up some cattle trucks. And I always think of my friend Bernice Gutierrez, who was born 8 days before the bomb in Carrizozo. And I always think, I guess her mom would have wrapped her up in a blanket and carried her in as they were herded into a cattle truck. And they can't sit down. I have no idea what he was thinking, but I can tell you this. They set a threshold at which time they were going to evacuate people in those cattle trucks. When they reached the threshold, they doubled it. When they reached it again, they doubled it again. And finally, they just told the men that were there monitoring to leave because they weren't safe. And the history is that nobody remained there for even 24 hours to monitor what was happening to the people in those towns. It's just by the grace of God that people didn't die, honestly, from the level of radiation exposure. Babies died, but that's the sad truth of all this. And it's unconscionable. It's ridiculous and unconscionable and not acceptable. And you know what? I'm with Beata. There's no more telling us, the victims of all this, that we have to prove anything. The people that live downwind of Nevada never had to rise to any level of proof. And our government should have come back long ago and done an epidemiological study so they'd know what happened to us. But to tell us to prove is absolutely the most ridiculous thing they could ever ask us. It adds insult to our already existing injury. And the next time that somebody asks me, I'm already ready. I'm going to tell them, you know what? You come back and prove that it didn't happen. I don't have the full resources of the US government. You come back and prove it didn't happen. We have so much information that's not available to us, by the way, you know?
Right. I mean, they did experiments on the effects of fallout on the indigenous people of Bikini Atoll and the Marshall Islands, specifically to figure out exactly what this does. So they know, like Operation Bravo, like they know exactly what happened to us because they did these studies for the specific purpose of figuring out that. And they get reparations, which in the grand scheme of things is like, it's barely anything, right? There's still children being born with birth defects there in the Marshall Islands. And of course, it's a military outpost, right? To incite wars of aggression with other countries. And I mean, there's also that purpose it serves. It's like they don't care, but also they are strategically looking at geographic locations to establish military bases in these places where the indigenous people are victims of the nuclear contamination, but also they end up getting them to service these institutions as employees, as service personnel, right? And force this relationship of economic dependency with the very people who are the most impacted by these operations. It's what Joseph Moscow calls the plutonium economy here, right?
Yep, lots of people don't speak up because they feel like their livelihood is dependent on, dependent on this. And we have to break free from that mindset. Nobody's doing us any favors. There have never been any favors done here. This is not a symbiotic relationship that we have with the nuclear industry in New Mexico. It never has been. It was never structured to be that way. Like I said, like I always say, we were collateral damage. We were just the collateral damage that resulted. If they cared at all, they would have come back and done an epidemiological study, within those first 5 years after Trinity. They would have started monitoring us. They kept track of every person that lived in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and they have taken samples, all sorts of human samples from them, and it's all cataloged, and they've kept track of everybody. They know what happened to every single person, but none of that has ever been done here. And there's a reason. It's to mitigate losses. It's to keep their responsibility as low as possible for the damage that was done. And as it turns out, as a result of Trinity and the other above ground tests at Nevada, which we were downwind of, by the way, New Mexico was consistently downwind of those tests, 93 of them. But as a matter of fact, most of the United States was contaminated by the Trinity tests. They now know because of the recent deposition mapping, and parts of Canada and Mexico. Imagine that.
I was in Eileen O'Shaughnessy's Nuclear New Mexico class, another amazing organizer and activist friend of ours we all love. And she was telling us how on the day of the Trinity test, they picked up double exposures on camera film as far away as Rhode Island. So this radiation was tracking all the way to the farthest parts of the East Coast on that same day.
Yep. It was dangerous.
That's a big travesty now too of why I think like the universal healthcare is so vital, because there's this like background radiation that they're calling naturally occurring now that is as a direct result of all of these tests and the thousands of detonations on populations of the planet. And our environmental regulations are so drastically different depending on what border you're at. or the protections. Like, I look at our water quality standards in the pueblos, and they're only for surface water. They don't even cover groundwater or stormwater or anything, and why do these sampling and monitoring wells magically stop at the Los Alamos County borders? Or all, it's just like, it's just such a masking of the harm, and this constant attempt at masking the harm that's ongoing, and then the gaslighting around that. When you go to public meetings or try to be involved in the public process in any way and assert our ways of knowing as land-based peoples, of like, well, what about when this goes into our groundwater? Or what about when this goes into our air through evaporation? And it's like, well, that's outside the scope of this hearing. That's irrelevant to this hearing we're talking about right now. And it's this way of like chopping up and making our interconnectedness with our lands and peoples, it makes it, there's not even a space for it. And that's more of the scientific racism. I was thinking too more of Oppenheimer and the scientists and that perspective, and there's such a deep conversation to be had around the impacts of imposed patriarchy on our society, and that entitlement and white privilege that came with some of those attitudes, and just and within that is, and this is where I'm putting on my kind of my birth worker hat a little bit, of the way the terminology around like calling him the father of the bomb, and like the way they named the bombs after like children, and just this like need for patriarchy to take on that power of creation and being and some twisted sense of like creative capacity, which is not life-giving at all, but like death-affirming and not life-affirming. And that's this like deep-rooted sickness of patriarchy, that wants to strip that from the true life-givers of this earth. And you see the language kind of twisted to reflect that a lot. And I've had to move away from when I first came into this work, and just like having to observe and step back and like, okay, like, let's not use language around birthing, around the creation of these weapons of mass destruction. Let's not use this creative capacity for around creating weapons for war, when there's nothing life-affirming about them, or there's nothing that's contributing to any kind of positive generational continuance on this planet.
Absolutely. And all that stuff is so intentional, right? That naming. I'm sure I can find this if I dig and kind of look for Oppenheimer's own words, but I mean, he was interested in like indigenous mysticism, right? He was reading the Bhagavad Gita, and he was interested in, as a theoretical physicist, in looking at, death and birth and cycles. But of course, it's only through the lens of like somebody who will never have like that kind of relationship with a place, with a people, with the earth itself, right? And I'm interested in kind of seeing what he thought about, we know that a lot of those scientists were interested, or, looking at this place through a very fetishizing lens, where they're like, oh, this is endowed with mystical power from the native people that are here. And they knew full and well that they were sacred places, right? We know that 2/3 of Bandelier is closed to the public because they were the very first sites of nuclear waste. And Oppenheimer and his brother were coming to New Mexico at a time when there was this massive movement, mostly art industry people, right? We had the railroads, we had the introduction of the Indian art industry, and something a lot of people don't know is that Oppenheimer had relationships with people who would be responsible for establishing the Indian art industry as we know it here. He was even associated with John Collier, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who was responsible for the Indian Reorganization Act. And so I'm interested in kind of looking at how the project of nuclear colonialism operated in tandem with the creation of the Indian art industry, in that as they are siphoning and extracting from our lands, they're also siphoning and extracting our culture, right? Our creative labor. And it's always been a dual process here as a way to embed Native people in these projects, but also to attract tourism, right? Nuclear tourism is a big thing that New Mexico is also known for. And there's this narrative that has been created by outsiders, right? By people who come and invade, by, our invaders, that make New Mexico out to be this exotic destination within the domestic, one in which things like nuclear bombs and aliens exist, but also where you could see primitive Indians, right? And this is like, and this also is in line with this like mix of cultures narrative, right? Like New Mexico is known for its beautiful blend of cultures, while just leaving out the very disturbing and violent realities of the conditions we live in today.
Yeah, and that was also the suppression of our matrilineal ways of knowing and our traditional healers and midwives. And when Indian Health Services came in, it was like this other different kind of momentum of like drastic change on our like landscape and our economic landscape.
And, we've already discussed that idea of white privilege. And, when I reflect on who Robert Oppenheimer is, his mother was an artist, and they owned very expensive art in their, high-rise apartment in New York City. And he had been exposed to a lot of things, and fell in love with New Mexico. Imagine that. And to me, it all comes back to that idea of white privilege, of people thinking that they're superior. And, it's what I said earlier about them counting on us to be uneducated, unsophisticated, and unable to stand up for ourselves. And we're not those people any longer. I mean, obviously, by the tone of this discussion, that's not who we are any longer. And, I always say we've lived here for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Look at the footprints that they discovered at White Sands National Monument, 23,000 years old. This was our place. We're rooted here. We didn't need any of them to come here. We had all the resources and all the knowledge and all the ability to take care of ourselves. We never needed them to come here. And so it's that idea of other people coming here, and because of their white privilege, they think that they can move in on everything that's sacred to us, everything that's important and sacred to us, our entire way of life, poison everything that we depend on, and leave. And we're fighting right now with Congress to get the RICA amendments passed. And what will happen is it will establish the very best health care for people who apply and meet the qualifications, and it'll pay partial restitution, not just to people today who are suffering with cancer, but we can apply on behalf of our deceased loved ones, and it'll establish RECEP clinics. But Beata's right. Our government needs to establish universal health care because they've damaged everybody. This industry has damaged people. And Beata, when you said that a few minutes ago, I thought how profound, because since Sunday, Sunday was the first day that the thought came into my head for the first time, our government's eventually going to have to offer universal health care based on the fact that now there's going to be this knowledge of how much damage was done by the nuclear testing. Because the fallout mapping that they released, they have also produced the fallout mapping for the 93 above ground tests in Nevada, and it's going to show the same thing, that our whole country was irradiated as a result of the nuclear testing. It doesn't go away. It doesn't go away, and people were affected every place.
Right. I mean, the United States is the most nuclear bombed place on Earth solely because of the amount of tests that have taken place here at the hands of the U.S. government. But the U.S. has also allowed Britain to test their nukes here in the Southwest as well. So, I mean, of course it's the most irradiated place. Like, also, Beata, thank you again. Yes, on the universal healthcare harkens back to the Red Deal, where that is one of our primary demands, right? Our demands are to end the occupation, heal our bodies, and heal the planet, right? And the thing is, these are things that the government very much can do. They very much can do. We have a military budget in the trillions, and we're asking for basic bare minimum human rights. And that's the thing that we emphasize to people. It's like, we're not asking for anything that's even especially radical or revolutionary. We're actually asking for the bare minimum.
Well, and I don't know if you guys saw this in the news last week, but it was in the news that New Mexico is one of the states that's carrying the highest medical debt of any state in the country. $881 million in medical debt. People in New Mexico own $881 million in medical debt. $1 billion. And I think to myself, why am I'm not surprised. Not after the stories I've heard about how people have to hold bake sales to buy pain medicine, sell cattle so they could pay their coinsurance. Today I had I saw a friend of mine from Mescalero, and he has a 9-month-old baby, a grandson. Since he was 2 months old, he's been in treatment for a pre-leukemic condition, and they have to take him all the way to MD Anderson in Houston. And he told me, if not for the fundraising that people have done to help us, he may not be alive. And it's like, ugh, how do we not stand up for our rights to just the very basic things, right?
It's so ironic that you say that too, Tina, because I mean, it's appalling, right? That you would need to have a bake sale to get that kind of treatment for your child. In the Red Deal, we literally say, what if the army had to have a bake sale to keep its doors open?
No
Right?
joke. I'm glad you said that, because I'm going to use that. I hope you don't mind. But when I talk to them, because they tell me all the time, oh, it's going to cost too much to add you guys to RICA. And I always tell them, no, we're not those people anymore, right? To call them out for spending trillions of dollars on this industry and damaging our environment, and they want to count pennies now that we're sick and dying, we're not going to stand for that. We're not going to count pennies now. Not going to happen.
Exactly, especially if it's no trouble to them to maintain 800 military bases around the world.
Yeah, next time they bring up the cost, I'm going to say, well, why don't you have bake sales at the Department of Energy and see how that goes over.
All right, so we're at an hour and 9 minutes. How's everyone feeling? I kind of wanted to move into closing questions and comments. I think what we talked about here is infinitely more important than spending a ton of time tearing apart this over budget, corny, sensationalist movie, right? Because I think what we have to talk about, our lived experiences, the stories we've shared here, the facts that we know, are profoundly more interesting, and not just interesting, but heart-wrenching, right? And so I think Oppenheimer comes at a very interesting time, right? In what ways would it be beneficial to get the public to sympathize with the creator of the nuclear bomb, or with nuclear weaponry in general, right? I mean, we see fear mongering in the news. We see these threats of nuclear war looming. It is absolutely intentional, right? It is propaganda. It's military propaganda, and that's really all it is.
Well, funny that you say that you asked the question about the timing of uh, Robert Oppenheimer receiving his security clearance back and this movie. And you really have to wonder if there's some underlying process at work here. I thought about that too, Jen. I thought about how are they trying to get us to sympathize with this industry in general terms because of what is out in front of us? And who knows, right? Who knows? I hope most people won't fall for it. But what I hear from people a lot of the time after they've seen the movie is, well, you kind of have to feel sorry for him. No, you don't kind of have to feel sorry for him.
He knew exactly what he was doing the whole time. You know, the movie frames it like, oh, Groves and Truman were just so terrible, but he knew what he was doing. And I truly believe he did it for the comfortable life, right? For the celebrity, for the notoriety, right?
For the notoriety. You just hit the nail on the head. For the notoriety. There's a great documentary about Oppenheimer right now on MSNBC. If you want to know the truth, because there's a huge inaccuracy in the movie. They show after the Trinity test, they show them kind of like dropping him off at the gates of Los Alamos, like he had no influence over what happened in Japan, and that's absolutely not true. He helped choose the cities. He helped choose the plan. He's the one that determined at what altitude to detonate the bombs. He was intimately involved in the bombings in Japan. So that's a huge inaccuracy. And I think that also adds to people feeling sorry for him. And by the way, so he gave up his security clearance. Big woo-hoo, right? What kind of, I don't see that as some big, I just don't see that as him suffering a whole great like what's the suffering associated with that, right? So what if you give up your security clearance? I don't see the downside, honestly, except it was embarrassing.
And it's a symbol of patriarchal power to have some weird level of clearance. I have, I see people who don't seek out mental health services or substance abuse services in our community because they don't want to impact their security clearance at the labs.
Right. No, I've seen people turn to alcohol because they get drug tested, right, for their job at the labs. And it's so disturbing. Like, people who have made their career spent 40 plus years there and they can barely retire, or if they do, that retirement runs out quick. And, I don't blame people for doing what they have to do to put bread on the table today, but I do want people to be real about what it means for tomorrow. Just to be honest, right? I'm not saying, quit your maintenance job, but I'm saying don't pretend it's anything other than what it is, right? Let's be very honest with ourselves and understand who is at fault and understand who has the power and who is to blame, right?
And what you're talking about too with the, like glorification of nuclearism kind of resurging with this, we have to have hope for abolition. Nuclear weapons are illegal with international law right now. We see the impacts of long-term drought in New Mexico and wildfires, and what this, and reflecting on what fire is and what the difference between atomic fire and fire that cleanses and fire that ushers in a new way of being and relating and regenerating for life, and it's interesting, the juxtaposition of weaponry and all the fires that we're observing even now with our relatives, globally. And reflecting on what fire is and what it does and the different powers that it holds and what we want to do with that knowledge now that it's come through so much iterations, and the way nuclear colonialism has just devastated populations and countries and peoples. And we cannot forget those, we cannot forget the hundreds of thousands of people that have died, probably millions. And that continue to, we'll probably never know, the full count. And I have to hope for nuclear abolition for my own sanity as a parent.
Right. I remember somebody like mentioned to Leona Morgan, again, also a friend, organizer, nuclear abolitionist. They said something along the lines of like, I think it was when she was on Democracy Now. But they asked her a question that was something along the lines of like, this is like some of the most demoralizing work that brings up such existential questions and crisis for a lot of people because it's so incomprehensible for most people, right? And she she said basically what you did, we need to have hope for a future without nukes. Like, it gets hard when you know the facts and you know just how bad it is and just how long it lasts. It can be hard, but I think something that Oppenheimer reminds us too is that the United States has tried really hard to make the atomic bomb an essentially United States thing, right? I always say the nuclear bomb is the core of US power, right? It's the heart of US empire. And I remind myself that even a lot of these other countries that have nukes that the US will often demonize in the media, they have still signed on to international accords for, no strike first policy. They have continuously, right, the DPRK, Iran, China, Russia even, they have continuously signed onto these agreements to not do a first strike, and the United States consistently is almost always the sole country that does not sign those accords. And so what that tells me is that the world isn't excited to use nukes, not in the way that the United States is, at least. It tells me that they have nukes as a last line of defense against, U.S. empire, because they don't want to be invaded the way we've been invaded, right? They don't want to be bombed the way we've been bombed. And so I kind of try to think to the international arena and think about the attitudes that people have towards the nuclear bomb elsewhere, and to remember that, perceived support for it is likely, it is the result of being propagandized. And it's also something that I think will fall out I think it's something that won't prevail with the younger generations. Because the younger generations, they're very compassionate and they are very aware of what's happening in the world. They don't have the rose-colored glasses on, which is kind of heartbreaking in a sense, because it means they've seen the world for what it is really young. But I have hope that, future generations and people in the international community, and I mean the whole, I mean the global South, I mean nations who are also working to defend themselves from imperialism. I believe there's enough power there, to put into motion the abolition and dismantling of nuclear weapons everywhere.
Well, sometimes it just takes one person being brave enough in a leadership role. When we signed the test ban treaty in the 60s, I always tell people to read the speech that President Kennedy gave. There's a lot there, but there's a line in there that when I read it the first time, it touched me in a deep way, because he talked about how they found out that children's teeth were displaying strontium, right? That all these baby teeth that had been collected were analyzed, and babies' teeth were displaying strontium. And he says in there, even if only one child has died because of this, it's one child too many because it's unnatural. We've got to get leaders to talk about these things in real terms again, because there's no winners in a nuclear arms race. There's only losers. And, we just can't go there again. We just cannot go there again. And we need to make sure as human beings that care about each other and the planet that we live on, that we make known our desire, our desires. And I've been really grateful for the conversation that Archbishop Wester has started amongst religious leaders about disarmament, because I think it has to start someplace. It's just like, when we started this conversation 18 years ago, nobody knew about the New Mexico Downwinders. Very few people understood the idea. And it has to start someplace. These discussions have to take place. And our young people, you're exactly right, Jen. I think young people today have been exposed to things that we were never exposed to. And it starts with, oh my gosh, it's so deep, and it's a whole nother conversation, but you don't have rose glasses on. Young people today don't, because they've been exposed to all sorts of violence that we never had to really deal with. And so I think it is through the eyes of young people today that more and more people are seeing our world, and it's not an easy look. It's not it's You know what I'm saying? I have been saying a lot lately, and I know this is going to sound really, really kind of, I don't know, sad, I guess, but I have said a lot lately that I'm glad I'm closer to the end of my life than the beginning of my life, because there are so many profound issues to be dealt with. And, you know, it's tough, but I worry constantly about my grandchildren, my nieces, my nephews, and it's just a hard place. But we can't give up hope. We have to continue to have hope. We have to continue to fight these fights. We have to make known what's important, and we have to teach each other. A big part of what we do is education, because everybody needs to understand this history. It's our history. Everybody needs to understand it.
Absolutely. And you, Tina and Beata, have laid the foundation for future generations to move forward and do this work. I know you've empowered me and given me the tools and education I need to keep doing this as well. And I know that that's just going to keep expanding and growing. So you two are just perfect examples of the power that exists in an individual, truly.
And it's all our relatives before us too, that that endured this in their lifetime. If we don't live to see it, it's like you say, like we have to keep trying, because of our beliefs, because of our life, because of what prayers have been happening, during our feast days and happy feast, because that's what we could be doing with our energy, with our brilliance, with our collective strengths, is carrying life forward in a way that is so clear and so aligned with place, and that's for everybody. And I think there's this clarity now around that, about like, no, we can actually do life affirming work as peoples. The fact that there has been this continuance despite this like nuclear colonialism and colonial violence, like there has been this continuance of these life ways, and that is way older than this less than 100 years of nuclear colonialism, and that we have that behind us.
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, I do believe that what we have here collectively, our bond, our kinship, our spirituality, our relationships to land, is all profoundly more powerful than even an atomic bomb. And in fact, I think it's so strong that it's a direct threat to the nuclear industry itself. And they know that. Well, I feel like this is a good place to go ahead and wrap up. It leaves me feeling on a high note about all of this. And I just have one last question for each of you. Where can our followers keep up with your work? Where can we keep up with you? Where can we read your work or view your work?
For myself, you can look us up at breathofmyheart.org. We're also part of the Communities for Clean Water Coalition and the New Mexico Food and Seed Sovereignty Alliance, which works a lot on protecting our land-based existence and protecting these things from environmental violence. So happy to talk more with folks if you want to reach out.
And then we have a really good website. We're actually revamping it right now. I think I mentioned earlier we last week we had 73,000 visits to our website, which is phenomenal. But if people want to know more about what we're doing and get involved with us, they can check out our website, which is www.trinitydownwinders.com. So it's plural, trinitydownwinders.com. And my contact information is there. And people can access a health survey. We've been collecting health surveys for 16 years now, and we have like 1,000 of them, and we just keep collecting them. We're doing that for a purpose. We want as many people in our database as possible, so when the bill passes, we can reach out to all of these people and help them become qualified if they meet the qualifications for the RECA restitution and healthcare. And yeah, so if people want to find us, that's how they can find us. And thank you so much, Jen. And I absolutely appreciate what you're doing and being included in this. And I always love sharing space with Beata.
Yes, I love you both. I love you, Tina.
Love you too, Beata. I read your poem all the time to lift me up.
Good. It was written for dedicated to you, so it's yours.
Thank you.
Both of you always lift me up. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Again, like, I feel good. My heart feels full. As morbid as it is to talk about these things, I think it challenges us to, like, really find, like, to find our, like, I don't know how to say this. I feel like this work challenges us to remember that we have a spirit, that we have a heart, and it almost challenges us to keep ourselves soft as we're doing this, because it's tough work, and you two are some of the strongest ladies I know. All right, this is work that is no joke. This is no joke, and I know how much you all go through and sacrifice to do this. Y'all are just warriors to me. So thank you so much again. And I will be in contact with the both of you moving forward about some upcoming stuff. But thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, and I'm going to go ahead and end here. Thank you, everyone.